My name is Samuel, and I need to tell you something before I start this story, because what happened at that dinner table 3 months ago didn't just change my family. It cracked open something I had been too trusting, too loyal, and too blind to see for 12 years. And if you have in-laws who manage anything for you, money, accounts, investments, anything, I need you to stay with me through every single word of this, because what I found out could be happening to you right now, at this exact moment, and you wouldn't even know it. We were 5 minutes into Sunday dinner when it started. My son Leo had been counting down to his Disneyland trip for 4 months. He had the park map folded in his jacket pocket like it was a deed to land he finally owned. He'd turned 12 that week. My wife Claire and I had worked ourselves to the bone for that trip. Extra shifts, frozen subscriptions, selling furniture we didn't need. We had non-refundable tickets, a hotel booked, and 2 weeks until we left. Leo didn't ask for much. He never did. But this was the one thing he'd asked for. The one thing. And my father-in-law Richard looked straight across that dinner table, fork still in hand, and told my 12-year-old son that he should give his Disneyland trip to his cousin instead. Just like that. No conversation. No warning. No empathy. He set his fork down and announced it like he was reading from a script he'd already written before he walked through the door. He said Leo's cousin Tyler had never been to Disneyland. He said Leo was older. He said, and I want you to hear this exactly the way he said it, "You're practically a teenager now. Act like it." Leo stared at his plate. And in that moment, something shifted in me. But what happened next? Well, my husband Marcus stood up and said just 30 seconds later, turned that dinner table into a crime scene. Because what came out of Marcus's mouth didn't just silence Richard. It pulled back a curtain that had been hiding something so calculated, so cold, so unbelievably deliberate, that none of us at that table were prepared for what was underneath. And before this night was over, we would find out that the Disneyland trip was never the real issue. A woman would ring the doorbell mid-sentence. A lawyer would hand us a folder. And we would discover that Richard hadn't just stolen a birthday. He had stolen our son's future. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand who these people were before you can understand what they did. Marcus grew up in a house where his father Richard was the authority on everything. Not in a warm, fatherly way, in a transactional way. Richard had spent 20-some years working in finance, investment accounts, asset management. He talked about money the way some men talk about sports, constantly, confidently, and with just enough jargon to make you feel like you were lucky to be in the conversation at all. He wasn't a loud man. He wasn't the kind of father-in-law who yells at football games or makes uncomfortable jokes at Christmas. He was composed, measured. He had that particular kind of quiet authority that you don't question, because questioning it feels like you're the one being unreasonable. His wife Diane was his echo. She had the gift of making every piece of manipulation sound like wisdom. When she said something that stung, she said it with such calm, such warmth, that you would walk away wondering if you'd misunderstood. She had a way of framing cruelty as concern and selfishness as sacrifice, and she'd been doing it so long that I think she'd convinced herself too. I met Marcus at 26. We built something real together, slowly, carefully, the way people do when they know what it cost their parents to raise them and they want to do better. When Leo was born, we were not wealthy people. We were two people in a small apartment who loved each other and made careful decisions. We didn't waste money. We didn't take lavish trips. We put things aside. And when Leo was just a few weeks old, Richard made his offer. He sat across from Marcus at the kitchen table and laid it out like a presentation. He said he had access to investment strategies most retail banks don't offer. He said if we allowed him to manage a dedicated education account for Leo, he could grow it at rates we would never achieve on our own. He said it was the most important financial gift a grandparent could give. He said he had done the research. He said the numbers were clear. Marcus trusted him. I trusted Marcus. And so the account was created. Every birthday, every Christmas, instead of toys or gadgets, Richard and Diane would announce, with a kind of theatrical generosity, that they were making a contribution to Leo's future. Marcus's yearly bonuses went in. My parents contributed. My mother in particular, a woman named Isla who saved money with the discipline of someone who had lived through harder times than most of us can imagine, had made a substantial deposit just 3 months before that dinner. She'd told us she wanted to boost the account before Leo hit high school. She mentioned it to Richard. She thought nothing more of it. We never asked for statements. We never questioned the account. We trusted the man who had offered to manage it for 12 years. And he had smiled at every birthday, watched Leo blow out his candles, and never once said a word. Now I want to go back to that dinner table, because I need you to feel what it felt like to sit there. Richard had barely taken 2 bites of his food when he started. Tyler, his other son Mark's boy from a previous marriage, Mark being Richard's son from his first relationship, had apparently never had a big birthday experience. Tyler's family had been through financial difficulty. That part was true. Mark had gone through some rough years, job changes, medical bills for Tyler who had dealt with some health issues. We knew this. We'd helped when we could. We'd shown up. But Richard's solution, delivered at a Sunday dinner that Leo had been excited about all week, was to tell my son that he should forfeit the one birthday gift we had sacrificed months of work to give him, so that Tyler could have it instead. He framed it as a life lesson. He said it would build Leo's character. He said family sacrifice was how you knew who someone really was. He said birthdays were just days. Leo's hands were twisted in the napkin in his lap. Diane nodded along with the patient expression of a woman at a school board meeting. I felt something rise in my chest, that specific kind of anger that is half fury and half grief, because this was not the first time. When Leo had made the honor roll, Richard and Diane had made sure to mention how hard school was for Tyler. When Leo had made the regional swim team, they had gently suggested we not post about it too much online because it might be difficult for Tyler to see. Every high point in Leo's life had been quietly, consistently, diplomatically dimmed. But this was different. This was not softening a milestone. This was asking us to physically hand it to someone else. I waited for Marcus. In the past, I'll be honest with you, Marcus had let things slide. He would smooth it over later. He'd say his parents didn't mean it the way it came out. He'd find a middle ground that wasn't really a middle ground. It was just a slightly politer version of the same surrender. I had accepted that as the cost of keeping peace. But this time, Marcus did not smooth it over. He pushed his chair back from the table. The legs scraped the hardwood floor and hit the wall behind him. He stood up and he looked directly at his father. Not with anger in his eyes. With something colder and more deliberate than anger. With clarity. He said 4 words that changed the course of the entire night. Tell me about the account. The silence that followed those 4 words was not a brief pause. It was a complete collapse of the atmosphere in that room. The air changed. Richard blinked. Diane's face shifted, not into confusion, not into defensiveness, but into something that took me a moment to identify. Fear. Not the performed fear of someone startled by a loud noise. The specific, recognizable fear of someone who has been waiting for a particular door to open and has just heard the handle turn. Richard said he didn't know what Marcus meant. Marcus remained standing. He kept his voice completely even. He said, "The college account you offered to manage when Leo was born. The one you said would grow faster under your management. I've been asking you for updated statements for the last month. You said you were waiting on paperwork. Then you said the bank changed systems. Then you stopped answering my messages altogether. So I made my own call." Diane reached for her water glass and didn't drink from it. Richard said they could discuss this privately. He said this was not the place. Marcus said, "We're discussing it now." Leo had gone completely still. He was looking between his father and grandfather with the kind of careful attention you see in children who are smart enough to know something significant is happening, but young enough to not yet have the language for it. Richard said the market had been unstable. He said there had been adjustments. He said any reasonable person who understood investing would know that accounts fluctuate. Marcus pulled out his phone. He said he had called the bank directly. On Friday. He said, "The account was closed 8 months ago." I heard my own heartbeat. The room did not erupt. It went quieter. That particular terrible quiet that comes when a lie that has been living inside a family finally stops breathing. Closed? I said the word before I even realized I was speaking. Richard looked at Diane. In that look, in that half-second exchange between them, I saw something that made everything else make sense. They were not shocked. They were calculating. They were deciding, in real time, how much of the truth they could afford to release and in what order. Richard said the funds had been reinvested. Marcus asked, "Into what?" Another pause. Longer this time. Richard said, "We needed a short-term loan." Marcus asked, "For who?" Diane spoke first. She said it had been for Tyler's medical treatments. She said the out-of-state specialists had been expensive. She said insurance hadn't covered everything. She said they had done it because that's what family does. The words were delivered with such practiced sincerity that for a moment, a brief, terrible moment, I almost felt guilty for doubting them. That's how good they were. They could make you feel like the villain for asking questions about money that belonged to your child. But Marcus didn't move. He said, "How much is left?" Richard said they had been planning to put it back before anyone needed it. He said the timing had just been difficult. He said it wasn't as simple as writing a check. He said the market had moved against them. Marcus said, "How much?" Richard finally said the number, $38,000. I felt the floor shift. Not the birthday deposits. Not just the Christmas contributions. 12 years of everything. Marcus's bonuses. My parents' careful, saved contributions. My mother's recent deposit. All of it. Gone. And the account had been closed for 8 months, and they had sat across from us at every family gathering in those 8 months and said nothing. You need to understand what $38,000 meant to us. It wasn't an abstract number. It was the vacations we didn't take. It was the restaurant dinners we didn't order. It was the upgraded car Marcus didn't buy when ours started making a sound we both pretended not to hear. It was my mother Isla's retirement savings, money she had set aside across years of disciplined, careful living, handed to Richard in trust because she loved her grandson and believed that the man managing his future was a man of his word. It was Leo's college. It was the thing we had told ourselves he would have even if everything else got hard. It was the insurance we had taken out against the uncertainty of the world, and it was gone, and Richard was standing in his own dining room explaining it like it was a market correction. He said it wasn't gone. He said it was helping family. Marcus asked what income he intended to use to replace it. Richard's consulting work had quietly wound down years ago. Diane had retired early. They were not publicly struggling. They kept up appearances well enough. But Marcus and I both knew they weren't sitting on substantial liquid assets. They had a house. They had a boat. They had the cultivated performance of people who were financially comfortable. But the actual numbers underneath that performance were something different. Diane said they had believed we would help if they had just asked directly. She said Marcus could be stubborn about money. She said that was why they hadn't come to us first. Marcus said, "So instead of asking, you took it." Richard snapped at the word. Marcus said, "What word would you prefer?" Leo spoke then, very quietly. He said, "Does this mean I'm not going to college?" That was the sentence that broke something open in me. He said it without drama, without tears, with the sincere, practical curiosity of a 12-year-old who had just heard enough adult conversation to put together a conclusion and was trying to understand if the conclusion was correct. I moved to him immediately. I put my hand on his shoulder and I told him of course he was going to college, and I meant it with everything I had, even though in that moment I had no clear idea how we were going to rebuild what had been taken. Richard leaned forward. He called Leo by name. He said it had all been for family. He said one day Leo would understand that real love sometimes required real sacrifice. Leo looked at him steadily. He said, "I didn't say Tyler could have it." Nobody answered him. Then Marcus said something that took Richard's careful explanation and dismantled it completely. He said, "Tyler didn't need out-of-state specialists." Diane stiffened. Marcus kept going. He said he had called Mark the previous week. Mark, Richard's own son, Tyler's father, the one this entire story was supposedly built around protecting. He said Mark had told him that Tyler's hospital bills had been covered by a payment plan they'd arranged directly. He said Richard and Diane had offered to help, but that Mark had declined because he didn't want to owe them. He said Mark had never received $38,000. He said Mark had never received any of it. The room went dead. Richard's face lost color for the second time that night. Marcus continued. "So where did the money actually go, Dad?" And that was the moment the doorbell rang. Nobody was expecting anyone. The sound of it cut through the silence like something scripted, except no one had scripted it. Richard moved toward the hallway immediately, too quickly, with the urgent, purposeful stride of a man trying to intercept something rather than answer a door. Marcus stepped in front of him. He said he would get it. Richard said Marcus didn't even know who it was. Marcus said exactly, and went to the door. Standing on the other side was a woman none of us had ever seen. Mid-40s, holding a folder. She was not dressed like a neighbor stopping by. She looked past Marcus into the house with the calm, practiced professionalism of someone who had delivered difficult information before and had learned to keep her expression neutral while doing it. She asked for Richard Lawson. Richard said he was there. She introduced herself as a representative from a civil litigation firm. She said she had attempted to reach Richard by phone and by email. She said she needed to formally deliver documents regarding a pending lawsuit. Diane asked what lawsuit. The woman said the allegations involved financial misrepresentation and breach of fiduciary duty. I felt my ears ring. Caleb, Marcus, took the folder before Richard could reach for it. He opened it right there in the doorway. He looked at the name on the complaint. He looked up slowly, and I saw his expression change into something I had never seen on his face before, a specific, quiet devastation that had nothing to do with surprise. The name on the complaint was not Mark's. It was Isla Patterson, my mother. 3 months earlier, my mother had mentioned, casually, happily, that she had transferred a substantial amount directly into Leo's account. She'd wanted to boost it before high school started. She'd spoken to Richard about it directly because he managed the account. She'd been pleased with herself for thinking of it. She'd said she wanted Leo to have a Real foundation. I had not thought twice about it. She had apparently thought a great deal about it when the money disappeared. Marcus looked at his father. He said, "You took money from Isla too." Richard started talking fast. He said it wasn't taking. He said it was an investment opportunity. He said the timing had shifted unexpectedly. He said he had fully intended to return it with interest before anyone needed to access the account. I said my mother didn't file lawsuits over timing issues. The woman at the door spoke again. She said the funds had been moved into a private development project registered under Richard's name. She said the project had defaulted. Marcus looked at his father. He asked, "What project?" Richard paused for exactly long enough that the answer arrived before he gave it. The lake property. 2 years ago, Richard had talked about a lakeside development investment with the enthusiasm of a man who had finally found the play that was going to prove everything he believed about himself. Luxury cabins on a lake outside the city. High yield. Ground floor opportunity. He had mentioned it at family gatherings with the casual confidence of someone who already knew the outcome. He'd said it was a smart play. He'd said the numbers were undeniable. I had listened and nodded. I hadn't known he was using our son's future to buy his seat at the table. Marcus said, "You gambled Leo's college fund on real estate." Richard said it wasn't gambling. He said it was strategic. He said the market had shifted unexpectedly and that any sophisticated investor understood that risk was inherent in growth. Leo was sitting at that table, completely still, watching everything. And then Diane said the sentence that made the entire shape of the evening click into place. She said, "We were going to fix it before anyone noticed." Before anyone noticed. I want to sit with those words for a moment, because they explain everything that came before them. They explain the Disneyland conversation. They explain why Richard walked into that dinner and, 5 minutes in, before Leo had finished his first bite of food, tried to redirect the family's emotional energy toward a story about generosity and sacrifice and one cousin giving something to another. If we had agreed, if Marcus and I had nodded along and said yes, of course, family first, of course Leo will give his trip to Tyler, of course we'll be the bigger people, they would have bought themselves something invaluable, our goodwill, our continued belief that they were good people making hard choices, our hesitation to push on the account because pushing on finances while simultaneously being celebrated for our generosity would have felt contradictory. They would have wrapped us in a story where we were the heroes, and heroes don't ask uncomfortable questions about money. They tried to use our son's birthday as a distraction. They tried to use a 12-year-old's most anticipated moment of the year as leverage to keep us looking the other direction while the truth stood 3 feet away. And the only reason it failed was because Marcus, for the first time in a long time, decided not to let it. Marcus closed the front door. He thanked the woman and told her we would be in touch through our own attorney. Then he turned and faced his parents. He said, "You tried to shame a 12-year-old into giving up his birthday to cover up stealing from him." No one argued with that. Richard looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not physically, but in the particular way that people shrink when the version of themselves they've been presenting to the world finally collapses, and what's left is just an ordinary person who made choices they can't justify. Diane tried once more. She said lawsuits tore families apart. She said if we walked out now, there was no coming back. She said we were being dramatic. She used the word dramatic about a situation involving $38,000, a defaulted real estate investment, a pending civil lawsuit, and a 12-year-old who had just asked if he was still going to college. Marcus walked over to Leo. He crouched down beside his chair. He looked at him directly and said, "We are still going to Disneyland." Leo looked at him carefully, like he was measuring the weight of the promise, like he was calculating whether promises still meant the same thing they had meant that morning. Marcus said, "Nothing changes about your birthday. This has nothing to do with you." Then he stood up and faced his parents. He said all future communication would go through their attorney. He said Richard and Diane were not to contact Leo. They were not to contact my mother Isla. He said if there was any attempt to pressure us, spin the narrative to family members, or contact Leo's school or activities in any way, it would be added to the legal documentation. Richard said, "You would sue your own father?" Marcus said, "You already decided that." Diane shifted tactics immediately. Her voice changed from authority to plea. She said they could handle this privately. She said they could arrange a repayment plan. She said there was no need for this to go any further. Marcus asked what assets she intended to use for repayment. No answer. Leo stood up from the table. He didn't cry. He didn't raise his voice. He said, very simply, "Can we go home?" We left the food on the table. No one stopped us. The car was quiet for a long time on the way home. Leo sat in the back with his jacket on, which he hadn't taken off the whole evening. Marcus drove. I watched the streetlights move across his face, and I could see him processing. Not the anger, which had already resolved into something harder and cleaner, but something older. Something that had nothing to do with tonight. Then he said something I had not been prepared for. He said, "When I was 19, my dad opened a credit card in my name without telling me. I found out when debt collectors called. He said it was temporary. He said he would handle it. I paid it off myself." I turned to look at him. I said, "You never told me that." He said, "I thought he had changed. I wanted to believe he had changed." And in those two sentences, 12 years of inexplicable loyalty made sudden, complete sense. The smoothing over, the giving benefit of the doubt, the reluctance to push on financial conversations. Marcus hadn't been naive. He had been hopeful. He had made himself believe that the man who violated his trust at 19 had grown into something different, a grandfather who showed up, who contributed, who offered to help. He had watched his father make the gestures of a changed man for over a decade, and had chosen to believe the gestures were real. They weren't real. They were cover. Leo leaned forward between the seats. He asked one question. He said, "Are we really not going to see them anymore?" Marcus looked at him in the rearview mirror. He said, "Not until they fix what they broke." And then Leo sat back, and there was silence, and I stared out the window, and I understood that Marcus did not mean money. The next morning, before Marcus had even made coffee, Richard's car was in our driveway. He had not called. He had not texted. He had simply arrived, the way people do when they believe that physical presence can substitute for everything they failed to offer in words. I saw him through the front window. Marcus was already on the phone with the attorney my mother had connected us with, a woman named Karen, who had taken my mother's case and agreed to look at ours simultaneously. When Marcus saw Richard standing outside, he ended the call mid-sentence and went out through the front door before Richard could knock. I stayed inside with Leo, but I could see them through the glass. Richard was not performing authority this time. He looked like a man who had not slept. He talked for a while. Marcus stood with his arms at his sides and listened without visible reaction. At one point, Richard gestured toward the house, probably asking to come in. Marcus shook his head once. After about 8 minutes, Marcus came back inside holding an envelope. He set it on the kitchen counter and looked at it without opening it. I asked what it was. He said it was a cashier's check for $10,000. He said Richard was saying he could get more, possibly by selling the boat, and possibly by refinancing the house. Possibly $10,000 against $38,000 missing, against my mother's separate contribution, against legal fees already accumulating, against the specific and irreversible feeling of having trusted someone completely and discovered that the trust had been a vehicle for theft. Leo walked into the kitchen and looked at the envelope on the counter. He asked if it was his college money. Marcus said part of it. Leo nodded slowly. Then he said something that stopped both of us completely. He said, "I don't want it if it makes everyone lie." Marcus looked at him for a moment without speaking. Leo said, "They keep saying it was for family. But if it was really for family, they would have just asked." There was nothing childish in the way he said it. It was a 12-year-old stating a fact that grown adults had been dancing around for 24 hours. The logic was simple, and it was exact. People who take things in secret and then claim it was for love are not describing love. They're describing the story they need you to believe so they can keep taking. That afternoon, Marcus made it official in writing. He sent a formal notice to his parents that all future communication would be directed through their respective legal representatives. He froze his own credit. He froze Leo's. He called our bank and placed a flag on our existing accounts. He filed a police report, not because he wanted his father arrested, but because the attorney had told him that documentation was the foundation of everything that would come next. Diane called me that evening from a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was 11 seconds long. She said, "You are tearing this family apart." I deleted it. I want to be clear about what tore this family apart, because I have thought about this almost every day since that dinner, and I want to be precise. The thing that tore this family apart was not Marcus standing up at a dinner table. It was not a civil lawsuit filed by my mother. It was not the moment Marcus handed that envelope back to a process server on his parents' doorstep. What tore this family apart happened 12 years ago, when Richard Lawson looked at his son's newborn baby and saw not a child to protect, but a financial resource to manage on his own behalf. It happened every Christmas when he smiled while Leo's grandfather announced another contribution to Leo's future, knowing the account was already compromised. It happened 8 months before that Sunday dinner when he closed the account and said nothing. It happened at that dinner table when he looked at a 12-year-old boy and told him to act like an adult, because making Leo feel guilty for having something was easier than admitting that the something was already gone. That is what tore the family apart. Not us. Not the truth. The lying. 2 weeks after that dinner, we were at the entrance of Disneyland. Leo was wearing the birthday button they give you at the gate. You know the one. Bright, simple, "It's my birthday," in cheerful letters that somehow managed to communicate both innocence and joy in a way that is genuinely hard to look at without feeling something. He had the park map out of his pocket before we were through the turnstile. He had the whole day planned. He knew which rides opened first, which ones were worth the wait, which snack was the one you had to get no matter what. He looked lighter. I don't know how else to say it. He had carried something heavy into that dinner 3 weeks ago and had watched it get heavier before it started to lift. But standing in front of those gates in the morning sun, with the whole day ahead of him, he looked like a kid who had remembered that he was still allowed to be a kid. Marcus squeezed my hand. He said, "I should have done this years ago." He didn't mean Disneyland. The lawsuit is still ongoing. My mother's attorney and ours are now coordinating on a combined case. The civil complaint covers financial misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty, and unauthorized use of funds held in trust. Richard's Lake Development Project, Lake Investment Partners, has attracted claims from multiple parties. We were not the only family who handed Richard Lawson their trust and watched it converted into a failed real estate bet. Several of his former colleagues and at least 2 other family connections are part of a parallel claim. Asset liquidation proceedings have begun. The attorney believes we will recover a substantial portion of the original amount, though the timeline is uncertain and the legal process is exactly as exhausting as you would expect it to be. We have not heard from Richard or Diane since the attorney stepped in. There are moments, I won't pretend there aren't, when I feel the particular grief of watching a family not break, but reveal itself. Because that is what happened. We did not lose something that existed. We discovered that what we thought existed had been replaced, quietly and carefully, with a performance of itself. The grandfather who contributed to Leo's future at every birthday wasn't contributing to Leo's future. He was making deposits into a story he was telling about himself. The grandmother who framed every piece of advice as wisdom wasn't guiding us. She was managing us, keeping us looking the right direction, keeping us feeling grateful and connected and slightly indebted in the way that keeps people from asking questions. And here is the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that feels most important to say out loud. They almost got away with it. If Richard had chosen a different approach that Sunday, if he had not made the mistake of trying to use Leo as his distraction, Marcus might have kept waiting for the statements a little longer. The lawsuit from my mother might have arrived without the context to make sense of it. We might have pieced it together eventually, but slowly, without the clarity that comes from watching someone's face when they realize the door has opened. Instead, Richard walked into that dinner and made one move too many. He looked at a 12-year-old boy who had a park map folded in his pocket and told him to act like an adult. And in doing so, he woke up the one person in that room who had been giving him the benefit of the doubt for 25 years. There is a thing that happens to children who grow up in families with a certain kind of parent. The kind of parent who is charming and authoritative and just generous enough to keep you feeling loved, where they learn to interpret the parent's needs as the family's needs. They learn to read the room early. They learn to smooth things over. They learn that their job is to be the bridge between what the parent wants and what the rest of the world expects. Marcus had been doing that job his entire life. He had paid off a credit card debt at 19 without telling anyone, because confronting his father felt more costly than just fixing it himself. He had let Leo's milestones be quietly minimized at every holiday, because the piece of the dinner table felt more valuable than the argument that would have followed. He had accepted every delay on those account statements because his father had always been the authority on money, and questioning that authority felt like questioning someone who had sacrificed for him. It took him standing in that dining room, watching his son twist a napkin in his lap while being told to give up the thing he had been counting on for months, to finally locate the line he was not willing to let be crossed. And once he found the line, he didn't just hold it. He went all the way back. I think about Leo a lot when I think about this story. I think about what it means to a child to see the adults around him telling the truth, even when the truth is expensive and uncomfortable and changes everything. I think about what it cost him to sit at that table and absorb the information that his grandfather had not been what he appeared to be, that the man who had shown up at every birthday and promised to take care of his future had been taking from it the whole time. I think about the question he asked in the car on the way home. Are we really not going to see them anymore? Not angry, not devastated, just trying to understand the new shape of things. And I think about what he said the next morning, when he looked at that cashier's check on the counter and said he didn't want it if it made everyone lie. He understood something at 12 years old that had taken the adults around him significantly longer to fully grasp, that there is no version of this that is repaired by money alone. The money matters. The legal accountability matters. My mother deserves to recover what she lost, and so does Leo, and so do we. But the thing that was actually taken from us was not $38,000. It was trust. And trust, unlike a financial account, cannot be restored by a cashier's check and a promise of future installments. What repairs trust is truth. And the truth in this story came out not because anyone planned it, but because a father stood up for his son at a dinner table in a way that he should have been standing up for a long time. And because his son, watching him do it, quietly understood that this was what it looked like when the people who were supposed to protect you actually did. I want to say something to anyone who is reading this and recognizing something in their own situation. Not necessarily the specific details, the college fund, the investment account, the in-laws, the dinner table confrontation, but the pattern. The way a certain kind of person can exist inside a family for years, taking up space, shaping dynamics, quietly extracting something from people who trust them, while everyone around them keeps giving benefit of the doubt because the alternative is too uncomfortable to look at directly. If someone in your life manages anything for you, money, accounts, paperwork, anything, and you have not personally verified the details of what they're managing, I am asking you, gently and directly, verify it. Not because everyone is Richard Lawson, but because the version of this story where we never found out is the version where Leo arrives at college age and discovers there is nothing there, and nobody can explain it, and the statute of limitations on any legal recourse has long since passed. Get the statements. Make the call. Ask the question that feels slightly awkward to ask because you trust the person and you don't want to suggest otherwise. The people who actually deserve your trust will not take the question personally. And the people who do take it personally are giving you the most important information they could possibly give you. The other thing I want to say is this. For years, Marcus had chosen peace over precision. He had chosen the smoothed-over version of events because it cost less in the short term and because he loved his parents, or at least loved the idea of them. The idea of a father who had changed, a family that worked despite its complications, a set of grandparents who were difficult but present. He had traded small truths for the preservation of a larger fiction, and the price of that fiction, it turns out, was $38,000 and his daughter's, his son's, future. I am not saying this to criticize him. I am saying it because I think it is the most common thing in the world. I think most of us have a Richard Lawson in our orbit somewhere. Not necessarily a criminal, not necessarily a dramatic villain, but a person we keep making exceptions for because the exceptions feel more manageable than the confrontation. A person we keep explaining away because we would rather believe the best of them than test whether the best is actually there. And I think we do this not because we are foolish, but because we love them, or we want to love them, or we remember a version of them that we are hoping still exists somewhere underneath the version that keeps disappointing us. That hope is not weakness. That hope is one of the most human things there is. But there is a point where hope becomes complicity. There is a point where the benefit of the doubt becomes the mechanism by which the harm continues. And Marcus found that point, not because he was looking for it, but because his son sat at a table with a park map in his pocket and a bowl of food in front of him and was told to act like an adult about something that had already been stolen from him. That was the point. And Marcus chose his son. We went on every ride Leo had planned. He was methodical about it. Checked the app for wait times, rerouted twice when lines got long, made good decisions under pressure like someone who had been practicing making good decisions under pressure for most of his young life. He got the Chuo he'd had marked on his map. He convinced Marcus to go on the one ride Marcus had said he probably wouldn't do, and then spent the next 20 minutes reenacting Marcus's face during the drop with the committed physical comedy of a child who has found something genuinely funny and intends to extract every last second of joy from it. He had a good day. He deserved to have a good day. And when the sun started going down and the park lights came on and Leo stood there looking at the castle lit up against the evening sky, I took a picture of him. He didn't pose. He was just standing there, looking at it, with the birthday button still on his jacket. And in that picture he looks like exactly what he is, a kid on his birthday, at the place he wanted to be, with the people who chose him. The lawsuit will continue. The money will be recovered in pieces, probably, over time. Leo's college fund will be rebuilt. Not the way we planned it, not on the timeline we expected, but rebuilt. We have started that process. We are working on it. Richard and Diane are working through their own legal situation. We do not speak to them. There is one more thing. About a month after Disneyland, Leo and I were doing homework at the kitchen table, him working on a history project, me reviewing some financial documents our attorney had sent. He looked up at one point and asked me a question that I have been thinking about ever since. He said, "Mom, why do you think Grandpa thought it would work?" I looked at him. He said, "Like, making me give up the trip. He must have thought we would just say yes." Why did he think that? I thought about it for a long time before I answered. And what I said was this. I think he had spent a long time watching people say yes to him. And I think he made the mistake of assuming that would always be true. Leo thought about that. Then he said, "That's kind of sad." And I realized he was right. Not in the way that generates sympathy or reverses consequences or changes what Richard did, but in the narrow, specific, purely human way that it is sad to be a person who spent decades building strategies for extracting things from people who trusted you, only to find that the trust finally had a bottom. Richard had been very good at reading rooms. He had been very bad at understanding that the room eventually changes. The room changed. Marcus is different now. Not in a dramatic way, not happier or sadder, not fundamentally altered in personality. But there is something he is carrying differently. A weight he has apparently been holding since he was 19 years old and got a phone call from a collections agency about a credit card he'd never opened. That weight is different now. Not gone, but no longer managed in secret. No longer the private responsibility of the person who was wronged. He talks about it. To me, to his therapist, occasionally to his closest friends. He says the strangest part is how much easier it is to breathe. He says he didn't realize how much of his energy had been going into maintaining the fiction, into holding up his end of the implicit agreement that said we don't talk about what Dad really does. We just keep moving. He said to me one evening, "I spent 25 years trying to be the son he wanted. It turns out the son he wanted was someone who would look the other way. And I'm not that person anymore." I told him he'd never really been that person. He thought about it. He said maybe, but he said he'd spent a long time practicing. Leo turned 13 this year. No big dinner. No dramatic family gathering. Just us and my parents and two of Leo's friends from school, in our backyard, with a cake Leo had specifically requested from a bakery 3 towns over because he had tried it once and never stopped thinking about it. My mother Isla drove in for the weekend. She and Leo sat on the back porch for a while after dinner, just the two of them, talking about something I couldn't hear from where I was standing. She came inside later and said, "He told me he wants to study environmental science." I said, "Since when?" She smiled and said, "Since the Disneyland trip, apparently." He said he had a lot of time to think on the rides. Marcus laughed from the kitchen. Leo heard him laughing and came inside to defend himself at length, with great seriousness, about the intellectual legitimacy of having important thoughts on roller coasters. It was a good night. It was a normal, uncomplicated, earned good night. And that specific ordinariness, is the thing they try to take from us. Not just the money, not just the trip, but the right to have a regular birthday, without a lesson in family politics embedded in it. The right to celebrate our son without managing someone else's feelings about it. The right to be a family that is just a family, without a performance running underneath it. We have that now. We didn't have to give it to anyone. If you are still here, if you read through all of this, then I want to close with the thing that stays with me most. At that dinner table, after everything had come out, after the lawyer had come to the door, after the check amount had been said aloud and hung in the air between us, after all of it, Leo said 4 quiet words that I believe were the truest things said in that house all night. He said, "Can we go home?" Not as defeat, not as retreat, as clarity. There was nothing left to prove in that room. There was nothing left to fix with words that night. The person he needed was already standing next to him. The people who owed him something had already shown, with 12 years of careful action, exactly who they were. And the place where he was safe was not that dining room. Home was where his father had promised him a birthday that no one could take away. And that promise held. That is the thing about real love, the kind that is not performance, not transaction, not the management of obligation. It doesn't require a dinner table audience. It doesn't need to be announced. It just stands up when it matters, says what is true, and takes you home. Marcus did that. And Leo knew it. And that is the whole story.